Welcome to Holy Tangents, a podcast for busy people looking to understand big topics in the areas of religion, politics, and philosophy, all shared from a Christian worldview. Let's listen in today's conversation with Troy and Stephen. All right, well, welcome back, sir. We're kicking off season 2. And we decided to do it with anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's a big topic. Glad to be back here at the table. And this is big. I think we were going over some of the angles we can approach it, because there's the political aspect. There's theological aspects to this topic. There's some current events, I think, in our country in particular that are really interesting on this topic. So I'm looking forward to it. Why don't you kick us off here?
Yeah. Well, so I wanted to, lots of topics here, right? So this is not, this was an old topic for a very long time, but now it's kind of been thrusted back into the limelight and popular consciousness. And so I kind of have an outline for us to follow, even though this is, our conversations are tangents, right? And so I can't promise that we'll stay on the outline, but at least to try to cover some of the things. And so I thought we could start off, you could intro the topic a little bit, then we could define our terms, like what do we even mean by anti-Semitism, and then talk a little bit about what's the biblical basis for where some of this stuff comes from and why people will use the Bible itself to justify some of these harmful ideas towards the Jewish people. Right, because all 12 apostles and Jesus were Jewish, right? So there's a weird disconnect there that maybe people don't always remember or understand or get. And then also just kind of end it with talking a little bit about, the reason why we're talking about this is because it's becoming a problem in modern politics, especially among the next generation, future voters, things like that.
Kind of a powder keg.
It's kind of a powder keg, yeah. And how that kind of, I think the last kind of voice of reason, kind of holding youth together, but moderates and conservatives on the right, was Charlie Kirk. And after his death, you start seeing things about Jewish people and anti-Semitism is just kind of exploded. And there's some other things that have contributed to that. But all right, without wasting any more time, why don't you intro the topic for us and tell us a little bit about why we're talking about this and go from there.
So I want to kick off with a quote. Some people, I'm going to read it. You may have heard it before. I don't know, but I'm just going to let it sit there for a second, and then we'll go from there. All right, so this is the quote. First, their synagogues should be set on fire and spread over with dirt. Second, their homes should be broken down and destroyed. Third, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds, which teach idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy. Their rabbis should be forbidden to teach under threat of death. Passport and traveling privileges should be forbidden to all Jews. Let them stay at home. And if we are afraid that they might harm us personally, then let us do what other countries have done and drive them out of our country for all time.
Who was that? Adolf Hitler?
Yeah, is that a general? In the Third Reich? No, it was Martin Luther.
Martin Luther, the Reformer.
The Reformer.
Okay, wow. Strong language.
Strong language, and you hear that, and I remember hearing that for the first time and really be blown away because we've talked about Martin Luther on our show here, and we admire so much of his writings. We, as Protestants, we rightly, owe tribute to what he did and how he stood out, and him and others. And then you read something like that, and you're like, how do you land there?
Yeah, you're right on so many other things, and then you're really wrong on this one thing.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, like what Troy just read, we would not share those sentiments with Martin Luther, but that's why we're talking about this.
Yeah, and so there's an entire history here that I think is worth going through, maybe at a 30,000 foot view with the time that we have. But like you said, starting out, the early church was Jewish. I mean, Jesus was and is the Jewish Messiah, of the lineage of Judah through King David. And all of his early followers were Jewish. I mean, I'm sure he obviously conversed with Gentiles from time to time, but we've talked about it before. He said, I'm here for the nation of Israel. And so he really was intent on reaching his people. And as the church grew, you can see at Pentecost, it was dominated by Jewish believers. But then it began to kind of shift a little bit with Paul's missionary journeys. You remember Paul, the Apostle Paul, of course, Jewish, was part of a mixed church in Antioch of Gentile and Jewish believers. Him and Barnabas went out. They started sharing Christ. And where did Paul go first at every new city?
The synagogues.
The synagogues.
Yeah.
And he did this for a couple of reasons. First of all, he felt it was his duty to share the good news of the Jewish Messiah with his fellow brethren, right? But think about it. He didn't have to start from scratch with them. They believed in monotheism. They believed in sin and the idea of substitutionary atonement. All these themes would be available to them. So all he had to do was connect the dots, right, with Jesus. But what was often the response that he got?
Well, he was met with hostility. Yeah. I mean, a lot of Acts is, I heard one pastor say, it's evangelism by riot.
It was.
Yeah.
And there were some exceptions like Berea, but for the most part, his Jewish brethren tried to kill him every time he shared the gospel. That doesn't mean there weren't Jewish believers, but what ended up happening was he said, listen, your blood be upon your own hands. I'm innocent. I'm going to the Gentiles.
That's
right.
What
did the Gentiles do in comparison? They received Jesus gladly, for the most part. And so what happened, within a few decades, you begin to see a shift where the population, if you will, of the early church was dominated by Jewish believers, and it became Gentile believer dominated.
Right. Yeah.
And so as time passed, I'm going to use a term here that we're kind of using for a collective phrase. We call it replacement theology. Replacement theology began to emerge. And the idea, very simply put, was that because Israel as a whole had rejected their Messiah, God in turn had rejected them. And so the church had replaced Israel. That's where we get the phrase from, replacement theology. So as such, the Jews became, in many people's minds, nothing more than a disgraced, contemptible bunch of Christ killers that deserved every evil thing that they got. That was the sentiment that really emerged over the centuries. And this manifested itself in a number of ways, mainly violence. Throughout the Roman Empire, you can see it even into the Crusades, which, hey, that's a topic for another day, right? But was mainly about, resisting Islamic expansion into the Promised Land and, the spreading of Islam. But along the way, the Crusaders massacred a very large portion of Jews. And you see it in the Spanish Inquisition. You see it, and ultimately, of course, into modern times in the Holocaust, right? I say all that because, and I don't mean this to sound controversial, but a lot of people we rightly ask ourselves, how in the world could an educated country like Germany do the things that they did? In part, I'm going to stress that, in part, that was possible because of a flawed theological system that had dominated Europe for centuries, and that is replacement theology.
Yeah. So before we kind of dive more into some of these things, let's define some terms, right? Because you've used the term replacement theology already, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about when we're talking about antisemitism. I think the term Zionism will probably come up. And then also I think it would be important to define things like Israel, right? Because the scripture kind of talks about Israel, Israelites in some different ways. It's not always the same thing. And then also when we say, when the scripture talks about the Jews, it's not necessarily talking about every Jewish person that's ever lived or anything like that. And sometimes, conspiracy theorists, they'll use the term the Jews. And that's not very helpful, right? Because sometimes they do mean all the Jews, right? Which is concerning. And then, but it's not the same thing that, like when Stephen, at the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7, when he's talking about the Jews, it's a euphemism for the Sanhedrin or the Jewish leaders.
The leaders.
It's not talking about Jewish people or anyone who has ever adhered to the religion of Judaism or has any kind of ethnic Jewish background or anything like that. So all right, so let's go ahead and let's define some of these terms. So and we haven't talked about this beforehand, so we might have some different definitions, and we might want to might iron sharpen iron, and
sure,
we might decide that, hey, I actually like part of your definition better, and I might refine my own. So here we go. So let's start with antisemitism. Antisemitism, as I understand it, is talking specifically. Now, it's become a blanket term to mean lots of different things, but true anti-Semitism is, when we say Semite, anti meaning against, Semite meaning Semitic peoples. It's specifically can be talking about Israelites, but really anybody from that general area of the Levant. So it could be just a prejudice towards that area of the world, specifically Israelite people, but also could include some other people, other tribal peoples. Although when you say the term Semite, most people aren't thinking about some of the other Semitic tribes that we don't really refer to by their ancient names. So technically, if I could be wrong about this, Palestinians are technically, some of them could have lineage back to Semitic peoples,
could be
right?
linked.
Yeah, it could be linked. And so obviously we wouldn't put Palestinians and Israelites in the same. We see them very differently, and we see Israelites as predominantly Jewish, even though Israelites don't always adhere to the religion of Judaism, right? So it gets confusing, right? It's an ethnicity and a religion at the same time. Yep. Which makes it sometimes confusing, right? So, but when I say anti-Semitism, shorthand, what I mean is that people, because as it's come to mean, as the term has come to mean in kind of modern times, is it's essentially a shorthand term for saying hatred towards ethnic or religiously Jewish people or adherents to the religion of Judaism. So when I say anti-Semitism, that's what I'm referring to. Someone that has hatred or prejudice towards the Jewish people, whether religiously affiliated Jews or ethnically affiliated Jews, or both. And really, I think true anti-Semitism would say that the problem is genetic, right? Because that's what the most extreme proponents of anti-Semitism, like Hitler and the Nazis, they would have said, hey, no, the problem isn't just their religion is Judaism and that they need to convert to a different religion. It's them as people. They just need to be
the people group.
The people group. There's something genetically flawed with them, and so which is evil, right? That is a form of racism. So it's, you could say, it's a subset of racism or ethnic prejudice. And so that would be the way I would define anti-Semitism. I know other people might define it a little bit differently or want to nuance that. What would you change that definition, add to it? What would you do with that?
I'm on board. I think you nailed it. And it does get confusing because, like you said, the term Jew, we often associate that with Judaism, but not all Jews observe Judaism. And even in the Bible, it gets a little confusing sometimes because, like the term Israel, at times it's a name for Jacob, right? Israel, I shall call you Israel. Other times it's referring to the northern kingdom of Israel. Other times it's referring to the unified kingdom of Israel. And so for the points of our discussion here, I think for the most part, when we talk about Israel, we're talking about the nation of Israel. The people of Israel in terms of its actual land. And so, yeah, I agree with you. Anti-Semitism, I think within our context, we're talking about resistance towards, hatred towards, brutality against the Jewish people as a people group.
Yeah. All right. Well, so let's go on to another term. It's the term Zionism. And so Zionism is a political term. We know that it kind of came about in the 1800s. Is that correct?
Late 1800s, and yes, I fully agree. And I don't remember some of the rabbis that were really pushing for this and really got into politics, but that's when it really started mingling into Western politics in particular, and the idea of the Jewish people having their own homeland again.
Yeah, and what's interesting, and tell me if I'm wrong here, so the idea of Zionism relates to, like you said, it's the idea of the Jewish people having a kind of going back to the promises made in the Old Testament, and for them to have these specific lands that are outlined and bordered by by those Old Testament covenants. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And you see even in some of the Psalms, referring to Israel as Zion. That's where the phrase comes from, Zionism. And, I think where it really kind of took hold on the international stage was with the Balfour Declaration. I don't know if you've heard it, but
no. Tell me about the Balfour Declaration. What is that?
So I think it was right. It was either right before World War I or right after. I think it was right after World War I. So a lot of Palestine, modern day Palestine, was controlled, for centuries by the Ottoman Empire. Then the British took over a large portion of it, and with that declaration, he was either the prime minister, and you'll forgive me, you guys can look it up on your own, but he was either the prime minister of Great Britain or one of the leading cabinet members. Basically, it was the first major country to support Zionism in its form that we discussed. The idea that Great Britain said, we support the formation of a homeland for the Jewish people in Jerusalem, in Palestine. It was a monumental moment. That was either, I can't remember, it was right before World War I. I think it was right after World War I.
Okay, and to be a Christian, you don't necessarily have to be a Zionist or support the actual state of Israel as it exists today, right? That's kind of the because there's lots of Christians that would not hold to that view. And so I guess that's kind of where it starts to get a little dicey, right? Is to be a Christian, you don't have to be a Zionist. However, there are many Christians that are Zionists.
Yeah, we often, factions are always part of what we do as Christians. We kind of get in our little camps and stuff. If you actually look at like the original covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the promises that God made to Abraham, when he talks about them giving him a land, the promised land, it's actually from the Nile River to the Euphrates River. So it's really interesting. Israel's never had that much land. Even in David's pinnacle days, they never dominated that much territory. And so the calls for that land allotment was very far-fetched. I think the original Zionists just wanted kind of a homeland around Jerusalem, at least at a minimum. But of course, Zionism in its present form is the full land, the full promised land of Israel. And you hit on something that I think is really important. You can be a Christian and support the establishment, the maintenance of the nation of Israel. That doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the Israeli government does.
Right.
I mean, that's where it kind of gets kind of dicey, because any questioning at all of the Israeli government is kind of labeled as anti-Semitism. You just kind of get blasted with this label. Well, I don't even agree with everything that our government does, Stephen.
That's right.
I don't think you would consider me un-American. I love our country.
No.
But to say that you agree, you have to blanket agree with everything that the nation of Israel does, I think it's missing the point.
I think so too. I'm glad that you said that. So, all right. So that's establishing kind of what Zionism is. Based on what you just said, let's go on to replacement theology, right? So, all right. So defining some terms here, and I guess this is where me and you might differ slightly. And so, I wouldn't consider myself a replacement theologian. Because here's why. Because ultimately, I do think that although I would say I'm a covenant theologian, and I would say most of the promises made to Old Testament Israel, if not all of them, are fulfilled in Christ. So therefore, every modern Jewish person or Israelite can take hold of those Old Testament promises, but they have to do so through the lens of Christ, or through union with Christ. So essentially, you become a Christian, right? Yes. Because Jesus was the Messiah, right? And so anybody who's following Yahweh and following Jesus, who is Yahweh incarnate, right?
Yes.
Jesus is the Son of God, the God of the Old Testament. So you're essentially following the God of the Old Testament as a Christian. It's the same God, but you're taking hold of those promises in the way that God has chosen to reveal himself, which is through Jesus. And so, again, this is where it gets a little confusing, I guess, for some people. And so I would say that God has answered all of the promises to Old Testament Israel, and he's given it a big yes, and that yes is in Jesus. And so, but how I would say that I'm not like, so where I would differ from like Martin Luther or some other people that are I think would take like be happy with the term replacement theology, is I would say that the people, so let me back up for a second. Let me just say this. So when I say that, I'm saying that the people of God, the people that have the faith of Abraham, as Galatians would say, that those people are those that have union with Christ, made up of both Jew and Gentile. So we would call that the church. And I would say that the church...
With a capital C.
With a capital C, yeah. Not like one denomination, but the church, universal. And the church, made up of both Jew and Gentile in Christ, that have put their faith in Jesus, make up the spiritual people of God. Now, in the Old Testament, those were predominantly Israelites, with some Gentiles,
proselytes,
that were allowed to become believers in Yahweh in the Old Testament. And now it is predominantly Gentiles, with some ethnically Jewish believers that now believe in Christ. But I think that one day there will be a promise fulfilled, as it says in Romans 10 and 11, that there'll be a mass revival of Jewish people that will come to faith in Jesus towards the end of time, right? Before the return of Christ. And so I would still say that there is that promise made in Romans 10 and 11 is still being held out.
Still valid,
yes. Right? And that any Jew can take hold of the promises of Old Testament Israel, but they can only do so by union with Christ. So it's not that the church has replaced Israel, or that Gentiles have replaced Jewish people as the people of God. No, it's like what Paul says in the beginnings of Romans 9. He says, not all Israel is Israel. And so saying that there's a spiritual Israel. And the Old Testament prophets talk like that. They say, hey, there is the outward Israel, that's circumcised.
Physical people.
The physical people of God. And then there's those that have been circumcised of heart, as Jeremiah urged them to, right? There's people that, hey, you're not just a Jew outwardly in your religion, but you also are faithful covenant keeper with Yahweh. And you love Yahweh.
Yes.
And you keep his commandments because you love him. And you're not an idolater, right? And so that's important to know that distinction was always made throughout redemption history, that there's always the outward people of God, the visible, and then there's those who are truly followers of God inwardly, and it's the same with the church. It just happens to be in the age that we're in now, it's predominantly Gentiles, and not as any Jewish people, but it wasn't like that in the Old Testament. But one day there will be this mass revival of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
So
I think we're pretty aligned, more than you would think. I mean,
okay.
I think where it gets where people get it a little confused. Okay, this is the key. You really, I'm glad you emphasized Christ, because Jesus said himself to a Jewish audience, "No one comes to the Father except through me." So there are Zionists in a traditional form. There are people in that camp that say they're God's chosen people regardless of Jesus. That's the That is not true. Jews need Jesus.
Amen.
We all need. He said, we all need Jesus. Paul said, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to the Jew first, and also to the Greek, to the Gentile." And so we have to be really clear. I think we're pretty well aligned. When people say, "Well, I support Israel, God's chosen people," Zionistic in the form that they don't need Jesus to be saved, that is not what the Bible. That's not what Jesus taught at all.
No.
He came to Jewish believers, or to Jewish people, and spread his gospel to them first. And of course, Paul said the same as I just referenced. So I'm glad you made that clarification. Where replacement theology gets like muddy is Jesus seems to teach it at times. That I was thinking about some of his parables. Like, for example, in the parable of the wicked tenants, or sometimes called the parable of the wicked vine dressers,
Right.
where really quickly, there's a landowner. He has a vineyard. He leases it out to tenants to take care of, farmers to take care of it. He goes off into a distant land. That's emblematic of God. The tenants are the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, and he says, "I'm going to send my servants to them." AKA the prophets to them,
Right.
to see the produce of the vineyard. What do? They beat them up. They cast them out. They mistreat the prophets. And he says, well, they'll believe in my son. I'm going to send my one and only son, and surely they will listen to him. And what did they do to him? They
killed him.
They kill him.
You're right.
Jesus is telling that parable while he's still alive, and he's saying that in the temple to the Jewish leaders. And he says, what is that landowner going to do? He's going to come, he's going to take that vineyard back from them and give it to others.
Yeah.
And so you read that and it sounds like, that sounds an awful like replacement theology. But again, as always, we need to hold these things in balance, because you mentioned Romans 9, 10, and 11. And I encourage listeners to go read them for yourself, because Paul deals with this like directly. God is not done with his people. He's going to preserve a remnant and draw them to himself, particularly in the end times.
Yeah, that's right. All right, the last couple terms, and I think we've already hit on one of them, is we kind of covered the term Israel. So I want to talk about the terms Israel and the terms Jew. So we already kind of covered it a little bit. Israel doesn't always mean a ethnic people, right? Israel, even in the Old Testament, is talking about there's a visible covenant people. And then those people can break covenant. And then there's a people that have inwardly, in heart, continued to follow Yahweh and have kept covenant with him. And this is the same for Christians as well, right? So Christians today, in the new covenant, there's visible Christians that are visibly a part of the church, that have been baptized, that participate in all the rituals of the Christian religion, but may not be saved.
They're
right?
Not in Christ.
They're not in Christ. They outwardly have, as the Westminster Confession would say, they operate, they're a part of the common operations of the Spirit, I think is the language says. But like Hebrews 6 in the New Testament, the letter of Hebrews says that there's a people that outwardly looks like they're connected to the people of God. They're participating in all these things, but Paul says that they're not saved, and we know that he says that they're not saved. I'm sorry, I was just saying that Paul was the author of Hebrews. That's not the case. But I think it's possible.
It's possible. You're not saying that dogmatically.
No. I always the author of Hebrews and air quotes, right? The author of Hebrews.
Definitely a Jewish author.
Definitely a Jewish author. But he's saying that there's a group of people in Hebrews 6 that looked like they were a part of the church visibly, but were not inwardly. Because then in the very next few verses he says, "But to you, I'm confident of better things that pertain to life and salvation." Yeah. And so we know that that's been kind of the theme all throughout from Old to New Covenant. If there's anything that's you want to hit on that's common between the two covenants, it's the fact that there's always been a outwardly visible people of God, and there's always been an inwardly covenant-keeping, truly faithful, genuine people of God. And I think that happens on today. So that's Israel. And next is this term Jews. Okay, so and when we say Jews, you almost today you have to kind of say, okay, what do you mean, right? Like define your terms, because when I think of Jew, like in common vernacular, you're talking about just someone who follows the Jewish religion or might be ethnically Jewish. It can refer to either, right? And you might say like sometimes I'll say like a conservative Jew or Orthodox Jew, and that's my way of shorthand saying, oh, they're a practicing Jew, or we'll even say practicing Jew, someone that's both ethnically Jewish and Jewish in religion. And then if I just say, oh, he's Jewish, but he's not a practicing Jew, or usually I'll say if they're an atheistic Jew or a progressive Jew, I'll say, oh, well, they're progressively Jewish, or they're Jewish in ethnicity, but they maybe don't believe in God. So even today there's ways that you have to qualify that one word, but the today it's usually the ethnicity is strongly tied to it. However, what's because I was in preparation for this talk to kind of see what all the conspiracy theories are about that people are espousing these days about Jewish people. So I looked into the history of this, and so this is kind of where the rub comes when using that term Jewish people. So there's a conspiracy theory out there that's it's been debunked, but it's okay. So ethnically, and I'm getting into the weeds here a little bit. Ethnically, there's two different types of Jewish groups that exist today. There's Sephardic Jews, which trace most of their lineage to Spanish or Middle Eastern families, that Northern Africa, Levant area. And then there's Ashkenazi Jews, I think is how you say it, which have more of an origin in Europe and Eastern Europe. And so for example, my uncle did a I think it was not
genealogy.
He did a genealogy test. I don't remember which company it was, but he found out, like, we thought, hey, we're Italian like my whole life. Well, he found out we're actually ethnically Jewish.
Oh.
So I found that out, a few years ago. So it is what it is, right? It doesn't. I'm a Christian. It doesn't change anything for me, but it's just kind of funny to know. And we're like very Jewish apparently. So, so you can genetically trace. Hey, I know. you can genetically trace these things, and so one of the conspiracy theories out there is a lot of the European Jews or Ashkenazi Jews. That they'll say that people say, well, the Ashkenazi Jews, they're descended from a kingdom called the Khazars, I think is the name of the kingdom, and the Khazars were these pagan Turkish nomadic people that came really to power during the 6th century AD. So this is during the Christian era, beginning of the Middle Ages, end of the Roman era. This is when like the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, was starting to send missionary journeys into the western part of Europe. The Byzantine Empire was at its it was, I wouldn't say thriving, but it's existing and maybe kind of on its way out. Islam is on the rise at this point, and so this is like the height of this kingdom, and they controlled a lot of trade between Europe and India in this what's called the Silk Road. And so these Khazars, they didn't want to become Christian, because if you became Christian, then now you're under the authority of the Byzantine, the Bishop of Constantinople, right? And you have to kind of bow the knee to those bishops, the Eastern bishops. And then if you become Muslim, you have to bow your knee to the caliphate.
Yep.
And so they just converted to Judaism, it's believed, out of political convenience, right? And so they weren't actually observing Jews. But here's where it breaks down. It was only like the elite royal family that did this. It wasn't the whole kingdom. And so a lot of people will say it's the whole kingdom. And so you basically had all these pagans that just converted to the religion of Judaism for political convenience, and those are that's the Jews that carry on to today, and are where the Ashkenazi Jews are descendant from. And there's a lot of pagan mysticism and theology mixed in with that Judaism, and so that's the Judaism that has supported and propagated Zionism, and they'll do this whole conspiracy, and so you can trace it all the way back to these people, and these people aren't even really ethnically Jewish.
Yeah.
They're just there's this people group that converted a long time ago, and they're mainly pagan, and they worship evil spirits, and so it gets really bizarre.
People love their conspiracy theories.
People love their conspiracies. The only thing that's true about that is that there was a group called Khazars, and the elites in the royal family did convert to Judaism out of political convenience to avoid becoming Christian or Muslim. But to say that, but it's actually been debunked. It shows that these European Ashkenazi Jews come from. Do you have direct lineage to Semitic peoples and things like that? So, but I'm telling you that this is one of the things that when you get into conversations with people that have kind of taken, I don't call it the red pill, I call it black pilled, and they've gone down these dark far right conservative like bunny or rabbit holes. They'll mention stuff like this, and so it's just but it's not true.
Yeah,
it's not true. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
That's really good to recap some of that, because, and you're right, people love to latch on to the reasons behind certain, power moves and political movements. We mentioned the Abrahamic covenant. I do think it's important to affirm that when, in terms of, defining Jews, God does come to Abraham and gives him a covenant, an unconditional covenant. I mentioned the land allotment. There's the promise of numerous descendants. There's the promise of the Messiah. People may ask, how do we know that it went through Isaac? Well, he does clarify that in Genesis 17. That Ishmael had been born, but that was not the chosen lineage through which these promises were to be fulfilled. And in fact, it was a specific grandson of Abraham, not Esau, but Jacob, through which the people group, the ethnicity of Jews would flow. And so we need to be clear that, and you can even find today, you can find Jewish people today that will trace their entire family history back to one of the tribes of Judah, or one of the tribes of Jacob. It's pretty crazy. I mean, it's pretty remarkable how much there's been preserved, that family lineage. And so I just say that because I think for our conversation, when I talk about Jews, that's the group I'm talking about. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, through that people group, the physical people, the Jewish people.
And I would agree.
Okay.
I would agree. All right, good. So we've defined our terms. Sorry to our listeners. That partly was meant to be instructional, educational, so you can kind of understand, because a lot of times these conversations about anti-Semitism are just conservatives and liberals talking past one another because they mean different things. And even Christians talking past one another because they mean different things by the certain terms that they're using. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about the biblical basis for this. So, obviously, like you already mentioned some of it, right? Some of Jesus's teachings, if not properly understood in context, can definitely be taken out of context and misconstrued to advocate for a harsh treatment of Jewish people and a harsh treatment of just those that are ethnically Jewish, and which would explain some of the eventual hostility, the rhetoric by different Christians throughout time. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. But before we jump right into the Bible, I want to mention an interesting character. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before. I think he's alive still today. He definitely is alive today. His name is E. Michael Jones. Have you ever heard of E. Michael Jones?
Sounds familiar.
So he's a Catholic conservative. And I would say that he would say he's not an anti-Semite. And I've heard him debate with Dr. Michael Brown, if you know Michael Brown, yes, Christian. He was a Jewish man, then converted to Christianity. Is now, I think, a professor of New Testament biblical studies, and I don't think he would call himself a Messianic Jew, but definitely is sympathetic to the Jewish people and has a really good understanding of the Jewish religion, having grown up that way. So he debated E. Michael Jones on this, and E. Michael Jones. And this is where I think he goes too far, right? So I would say that E. Michael Jones would say, "Well, I don't hate ethnically Jewish people." He would say, and so he would differentiate himself from Nazis or the Third Reich. Sure. He would say, "Yeah, it's not the ethnicity, but this is where he's hard to follow. So it's is it the religion then? So if someone converts to Christianity, and he would say, I think he would say yes. If a Jew converts to Christianity, they're no longer under this curse, right? And so it gets weird. So follow me here. Sorry. So this is kind of I think this kind of thinking, because a lot of people today will not take the side of a Hitler or white supremacy or go that far in their anti-Semitism, but they do kind of play around with what E. Michael Jones is talking about. So E. Michael Jones is essentially saying that the Jewish people, even though as Christians we would say anybody who's not in Christ needs forgiveness of sins, and they're among the lost nations, course. Right? Yeah. So that's not anti-Semitic to say that, right? Every Christian would say that, right? That would go for every tribe, every tongue that doesn't profess Christ. E. Michael Jones would say, though, that the Jewish people, because they rejected Christ, and the way he he defines it as, he would say they rejected logos, right, which is a New Testament term
Specially
for Christ.
revealed, yes.
Yes. So they've rejected logos, and they would say because Jesus is the logos, he's the Word made flesh. But part of that meaning of logos is Jesus is the embodiment of reason. So he would say that the Jews have rejected reason, and they've been cursed in a special way. So this is where I would disagree with him.
Sure.
They've been cursed in a special way, and they have what he would call a revolutionary spirit. He would say a satanic spirit that whether you're a conservative Jew or a liberal Jew, you're always bent towards this kind of revolutionary hostility against Christ.
Wow.
So like even if your moral values, if you're a conservative Jew, might look similar to Christianity, he would say ask enough questions and you'll see where it deviates. And this would be like what he's talking about when you say like things like when Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro are talking with Jordan Peterson about the Beatitudes, and Jordan Peterson brings up Jesus' words about the Beatitudes where it says, hey, it's not just, the law said don't lust outwardly. Jesus said that's not enough. Even if you lust in your heart, right, it's you're sinning
committing
against
adultery,
God. You're committing adultery. And so Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro, when they were talking with Jordan Peterson about this, I think it was in a lecture or like a roundtable discussion about the Ten Commandments and or the Sermon on the Mount, or it might have been one of those things, but they were talking about the Bible. And Dennis Prager is like, well, I would disagree with that as a conservative Jew, and so did Ben Shapiro, and he would advocate for the use of pornography. And so, again, I would say that's just that's kind of I would disagree with Dennis Prager, and I would disagree with Ben Shapiro, but I would not say that belief is indicative of all Judaism.
Yeah, I wouldn't lump them together. Yeah.
No, I wouldn't lump that together. Now, there are some rabbis that own porn production companies.
Which is shocking.
And so they're probably following that same strain that Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager would. And basically their thinking is as long as I'm not doing it outwardly and it's happening inwardly, I'm still protecting my marriage and I'm keeping myself safe. And obviously guys like Matt Fradd from Pints with Aquinas and other Christians have kind of like called that out and said, well, that's absolutely nonsense. That's not the teaching of Jesus. And so, but E. Michael Jones would take an example like that, and he would say, look, they're cursed. They say they defy the Logos, and so they're cursed in a special way. I just don't see that, right? I don't see that. Are all lost people to some extent, if you don't have Christ? I think everyone that doesn't have Christ is going to have a faulty logic,
of course,
or messed up thinking.
The sin impacts the mind.
Yes, I don't think it's just
No.
Jewish people.
And Paul, and that's a really good point. Paul would say that there's a veil over the Jewish people.
Sure.
We can interpret what that means, but Jewish people are hard to reach for Christ, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But I agree with you. I wouldn't go as far to say that that's a special, a cursed state that prevents them from coming. In fact, today, in the past, if you follow statistics with organizations like Jews for Jesus, there are more Jewish believers in Jesus today than since the time of Jesus, since the early church. There is kind of a growing awakening among Jewish believers. I think that's an extreme position from E. Michael Jones. I agree with you. All sinners are, I would say just hopelessly blind in their sin. That's why they need to be awakened by Christ, quickened by His Spirit. That's. I wouldn't go that far as well. I agree with you.
Yeah. Well, so with that being said, the reason why I brought that up is because there's a few verses that people like E. Michael Jones.
Yes.
And I just bring him up as an example, but there's people like a Nick Fuentes who we'll get to, who take those ideas and kind of go even further with it, and you're hearing this kind of rhetoric, like these same ideas being echoed more and more among conservative circles. So here's a Bible verse. Let's look at Acts 7. All right, and so this is the stoning of Stephen, right? And so for those of you guys that don't know, Stephen was one of the early deacons in the New Testament church.
Jewish.
He was Jewish, yes. He was, I think he was Greek and Jewish, which is
Yes.
why I think all of those early deacons were they were Jewish and Greek.
Yes.
And they did that on purpose to kind of unite what was a divided church, a
Yes.
divided Gentile Jewish church. Yeah. And so, well, Stephen was the first martyr also of the Christian religion. So his death is recorded. He was stoned by a group of Jewish people that were hostile to Christianity.
Yeah.
And here in Acts 7, he gives this whole big sermon as to how the Jewish leaders of his time rejected the Messiah, and actually calling them to repentance, right? He gets to, it's Acts 7:43, and he says this very interesting thing. He says, and I'll start in verse 42. It says, But God turned away and gave them over to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. So he's talking about the Jews, the idolatrous Israelites of the Old
Yes.
Testament. And then it says, he quotes, he's quoting the Old Testament prophets here. He says in verse 42 of Acts 7, he says, Did you bring to me slain beasts and sacrifices during the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? And then verse 43, it says, You took up the tent of Moloch, meaning that you worshipped the false god Moloch.
Yep.
And then he goes, And the star of your god Rephan, the images that you made to worship. Now, here's where it gets a little confusing, Troy, and I honestly don't know what to think about this. I know I don't agree with E. Michael Jones, right? And depending on who you talk to, people have different theories on what is said here by Stephen. So he mentions two things. He mentions a false god named Moloch. He says that what he's saying is not all Jewish people, but there's a contamination of, you could call it Second Temple Jewish religion of the time of Jesus.
Yes.
There's a contamination where pagan ideas slipped in, and some people believe have carried on in certain strains even to this day, right? And so I'll tell you why people would say that. And again, ultimately, we don't know if what's going on here or not. But that what's interesting here is when he says you worship the star of your god Rephan. So the ancient people would often believed that the fixed stars in the heavens were actual stars.
Yep.
But then they also believed that the planets who look like, when you're looking at them from Earth, sometimes some planets, they're so far away, look like stars. Right? When they moved around in orbit, they believed that those stars that moved around in orbit could be worshipped as gods, these ancient peoples, and they often would do that. And so it was believed that some of those practices were incorporated into to Second Temple Judaism, and some of the Sanhedrin were guilty of these things, and that's what Stephen's calling them out for.
Wow.
And this is where it gets dicey, because the star of the god Rephan, or Rephaim, is a six-pointed star, right? And so some historians will say, hey, you can't tie the Star of David, which is on the flag of Israel, the six-point star, you can't tie that back to the Star of Rephan. They look similar, but it's not the same star, right? And that's kind of where it ends, right? And historians just don't know. But we do know is the Star of David is never used in the Old Testament. The only time the Star of David comes about, it's first being used, I think, in the 3rd century A.D. So this is 250 years or so after the time of what we would call the early church.
Yeah.
And then it really didn't become popular till the 1400s, so till the Middle Ages. And so and it is a pagan symbol. Way before it was used by Israel on Israel's flag, it was used in ancient Semitic religions. It was used in Hinduism. It's used in ancient Sumerian religions. And so, but to be fair, that would be like saying that everyone who uses a star is means it in a satanic way or in a pentagram way, right? So that's why you can't draw a direct correlation between the Star of Rephan and the Star of David. However, there are some people that would want to make that connection, and so that reading Stephen that way can sometimes get people to think, oh look here, this is still happening today.
That's where it came from,
and it's satanic. Now, could those things be connected? Possibly. To say that there's been this, multi-century Jewish conspiracy since the time of Christ, no, I would disagree with that. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think when you look at Stephen's, well, you could call it a sermon, right? That he preaches. You see this similar thing with Peter. As you were sharing that, I was immediately thinking about Pentecost, where Peter, of all people, stands up and basically accuses all the predominantly Jewish. Now, there were some proselytes in town, of course, we know that, speaking different languages. But Peter tells them that you took Christ, you with wicked hands have crucified the Son of God. And of course, from that, there's this massive repentance and revival and awakening. It's interesting to me that when the same gospel message is preached, you see this all the way throughout the book of Acts, by the way, you just get two totally different responses. I mean, even among the Jews. And so I'm just immediately going back to what you were talking about, E. Michael Jones. I mean, clearly there wasn't an accursedness over those people that believed. They got converted.
That's right.
And today, as I mentioned, there are many Jewish people being converted. I mean, a lot of the things that I've discussed here, I didn't know before. My wife and I, when we lived in D.C., our pastor was Jewish.
Yeah.
Lon Solomon. And to this day, he's one of the greatest Bible teachers that have influenced my life ever. He wasn't a Messianic Jew in the sense that he observed kosher law and all that stuff. He enjoyed a good pork barbecue sandwich.
Sure,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But by ethnicity, a Jew. But in Christ, a follower of Jesus, a part of the church.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I keep going back to that, this idea. And that's where the hostility, I think, comes in from a lot of people, that because the Jews, there's our term again, right, had rejected their Messiah, they deserved punishment. Now, God, interestingly, and throughout the Old Testament, does use pagan nations to judge his people, doesn't he? I mean,
he does.
He does it many times with the Babylonian captivity. And I don't like to use the term punishment, but if you kind of look back the past 2 centuries, you could argue God has judged and punished his people Israel for what they did. I mean, we mentioned some of the horrible mistreatment of Jews over the centuries. It was reaching its zenith with like 6 million Jews being exterminated in the Holocaust, which was, I think, like half of the Jewish population of that day. You could argue that, okay, God has meted out judgment for that rejection, but that's the key thing. It's not a full rejection, right? And I don't know if you're going to get into like Romans, if some of the other passages. Paul himself answers to this. He's like, is God done? Has he left off his people? Has he fully rejected them? He says, certainly not. He's not done with his people. They have a part to play in his plan of salvation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I am going to mention one other passage, and then we can go to Romans 11 if you'd like. I think that would probably be a good place to go. So Revelation 3:9 is another verse that people interpret. And so I'll just read this. Revelation 3:9, I'll start in verse 8. In Revelation chapter 3, it says, I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door. I lost my place. Hold on. I have set before you an open door which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. And so that idea of, hey, there's people that said that they are Jews, but lie, that are not truly Jews, I will make them bow down at your feet, right? And so some people would say, okay, that's a prophecy, or they would try to interpret that as a prophecy about Jewish groups today. And again, I don't think that that's what's happening there. I think that's talking about Jewish leaders, not the Jewish people as a whole, that are martyring and persecuting some of these early Christians, and it's because they have they're motivated by this. I think I would say it's a satanic zeal. Yeah. Paul would admit it, right? It's this zeal to kind of they think that they're following God, and they're destroying image bearers of God. And so I think what's going on there is because it's John in Revelation taking dictation from Christ. I think there was Jewish people that disagreed with Christians at that time, but they weren't actively trying to hunt them down or kill them, right? And so I think there was probably Jewish people that they were outside of Christ. They did not accept Christ as the Messiah, but they were still following the law, still trying to live a peaceable life, right? Still needing Jesus, right? Still needing forgiveness of sins, but not actively trying to hunt down Christians like some synagogue groups were, and some of the Sanhedrin was, and like the Apostle Paul, for example, was trying to. So I think it's talking about a very specific group of Jewish leaders. Not all.
Yes.
And so to say that that all Jews all Jews are of the synagogue of Satan because they are not Christians or not following Christ is, I think it's following along the same lines of that E. Michael Jones language, that they're accursed people in a special way from other people that are not Christians or not following Christ or still dead in their trespasses and sins. And so I just wanted to bring up that verse and kind of clarify.
I'm glad you did, because this is why we need to practice comparing Scripture with Scripture. I mean, that it is so easy to take a text out of its context and kind of latch onto that and fuel some pretty dangerous ideologies and ignore other passages of Scripture. That's where I think the balance is so important. We've talked about these verses. You know, you think of even some of the parables, some of the harsh treatment that Jesus, portrayed towards the Jewish leaders, because they knew better. They knew they were supposed to know better about the coming of the Messiah. He was doing all the signs and miracles, yet in their stubbornness, they still rejected him and ultimately crucified him. And you can't pick one set of verses where it seems to kind of like support not just the replacement, if you will, there's our word again of Israel, but hostility towards Israel. God works out that plan towards all peoples. All people will face judgment. And like I said, I think if you want to say, okay, that was a special case, they rejected their Messiah as a whole, I think he has meted out judgment in large fashion over the centuries, but he's not done. And that's why I mentioned in Romans 11, and I think this is why it's so important for us as Christians to have this kind of mindset. And you identified this really well a few minutes ago. Like, our perspective should be one of compassion.
Yeah.
A heart for the lost in general, but lost Jewish people in particular.
Yes.
That was the Apostle Paul's attitude. His heart was broken that his fellow Jewish people rejected their Messiah. And yes, in their own blind zeal, like you said, Paul thought he was doing the right thing by persecuting Christians. It took a physical, visible manifestation of the risen Lord Jesus to convert him. And so he knew how hard it was and how blinded he was in his former self and how blinded his fellow Israelites were. I think he says something like, I myself would be accursed if my nation could be saved. I'm paraphrasing, of course. That's his heart. Like, he was broken. He wanted them to know the Jesus, the fulfillment of all the promises of God, but they rejected time and time and again. But he says this in Romans 11, and I encourage the listeners to read these passages. We're just kind of hitting some samples here, but he says, I say then, hath God cast away his people? Talking about the Jews.
Yeah.
He says, God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew. And he goes on further down, Lord, they have killed thy prophets, dig down thine altars, and I am left alone. He's talking about prophets. And go down to verse 7, he says, what then? Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election, talking about the church, hath obtained it, the rest were blinded. And he goes on to talk about like how he has a plan that all Israel, we can dig into that maybe another time, all Israel will be saved. He goes on to say further down. But at the very least, what we can agree on is that this was not a full casting away, a full cursing of his people.
That's right.
There were still people in Paul's day and today getting saved, Jewish people by ethnicity coming to believe in the Messiah, Jesus.
Yeah, that's really well said. Let's so with that in mind, let's move into, let's land the plane here on, what's going on in the modern day. And so let's start with, because you can't talk about this topic without mentioning this. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting excited, Troy. All right, I was gonna mention the death of Charlie Kirk, but actually,
Sure.
Actually, I think he goes back even further than this. So let me mention this. All right, so let's start with 1919, after World War I, the Weimar Republic in Germany, called Weimar because they the government was formed in that city in Germany. And so essentially it was a democratic republic, or they had a democratic constitution. It was a very, very liberal democracy. And a lot of, I think, the social leaders, the governmental leaders happened to be Jewish. I think there was a strong among Jewish people at that time in Germany, I think there was a strong affection for communism, Marxism.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the social reforms, just some of the morality of the people of that time, which was at the time, I think, not observing or practicing Jews, but was put forth by a lot of, liberal Jews, not observing Jews, atheistic Jews, a morality that was not biblical, right? Did not come from the Old Testament, was not in line with the Ten Commandments or the Mosaic Law, but would, in a lot of scary ways, you see history repeating itself, look really similar to maybe the last 15 years in our own country, where you see the rise of same-sex marriage. You see some like the trans movement, and just this kind of sexual revolution, this casting off of biblical ethics in regards to sex, and in art and in music and entertainment. And so all this was happening in Weimar, and you have a lot of fatherless young men who lost their fathers in World War I, are now growing up into this government, and they're looking for they're seeing the Germany of old, or the Germany they heard about, kind of falling apart and being torn apart by Marxist ideas, by progressive ideas, by ungodly and unbiblical ideas, and they don't have a voice. They never had a father figure, and so in comes a man, like Adolf Hitler, right? And here are these young guys, and he's a father figure to them, and so you have these young men starting to take this conservative bent and wanting to regain regain the Germany that they believed that they had lost, and following the wrong person and believing the wrong narratives
with no moral compass.
To accomplish that. And so I only bring that up because you're starting to see similar trends and similar rhetoric today in the United States. Now, again, before anyone freaks out, I'm not talking about Donald Trump. All right, so please
don't email us and write us letters.
Donald Trump is pro-Israel, right? Donald Trump is a boomer conservative. He's a Winston Churchill fan. All that stuff, right? So I'm not talking about Trump. I am talking about a lot of people that are trying to hitch their wagon to Trump and the conservative movement. And I think you had some moderate conservative voices like Charlie Kirk that, to use an analogy, were kind of like that from the Dutch parable of the little boy that keeps his finger in the dam. And Charlie Kirk saw that that boomer conservatives were not relating to young conservatives, and that he was trying to bridge that gap.
Yes.
And he was trying to encourage support for traditional conservatism, traditional family values. He was not anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. Charlie Kirk didn't always agree with the Israeli government, right? Which is, we already said, you don't have to agree with the Israeli government on everything. That's not anti-Semitism. Yeah. But he was not encouraging Jew hatred.
Yes. He was pro-Israel, yeah.
Yeah. And so, but you had a lot of people, I think, that he was kind of not holding back, but he was standing in the way of being those voices on the far right that do have Jew hatred, that did want to inject Jewish conspiracy theories about Jewish global takeover and stuff like that, and try to be that father-like voice to the fatherless. And so I think when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, it left a void. A big gap. And that void has not been filled yet.
No.
And there's been a lot of bad actors and bad characters that have been trying to fill that void and jump in. And I think it's been a catalyst in conservative politics that's starting to shift a lot of men and a lot of Christian men to what I would say is the far right, and not in a good way. That's very reminiscent of that time in Germany between 1919 and 1933.
But I want to contrast that with, clearly Charlie Kirk was a conservative. When we say far right, and I think we would agree, these are people that are not anchored in a Christian worldview like Charlie Kirk was.
That's right.
So they would espouse, quote unquote, conservatism, if you will, but devoid of that moral compass. That's why I mentioned that about early pre-Nazi Germany, because there was this sort of all these conservative themes, but it wasn't anchored in biblical truth. And it led to some horrific, devastating consequences. So it is a bit alarming to see that trend. I mean, if you look at modern events and what's going on, I would say on the political left has been always like less pro-Israel. And you see it's gotten worse, certainly on the left, with like the pro-Palestine kind of movement, with the war in Gaza after Hamas and the terrorist attack on I think it was December 7th, a couple of years ago, and all the war that's followed since then. So there's just been kind of like this hatred towards Israel for that in response to that, which is kind of nuts to me. It was a horrific terrorist attack by Hamas on them. Now, in all fairness, the Israeli government, it's a war, so there's been some innocent civilians that have died as well. And so there's just a lot of like shouting, especially, like I said, on the political left, standing for Palestine, anti-Israel, that Israel is like the oppressor in this situation, which is always mind-boggling to me because they have like this like little sliver of land compared to like an entire Middle East that's dominated by Arab peoples and Islam in particular. We've talked about that before, and I think it is pretty alarming that while the left has been anti-Israel, we're starting to see some fissures in the conservative spectrum, if you will.
Oh, yeah.
In that, leaning towards that way as well. That's what's alarming about what's going on.
Well, and what's concerning is you can see all the chess pieces being moved in place. Not that there is some kind of master chess player. If there is one, it would be Satan and the powers unseen, the evil powers unseen. But think about it. We have a growing militant Islam in Europe. We have liberal progressives that are catching the Jew hatred fever.
Yep.
And now we have far right conservatives that are catching the Jew hatred fever. And I think one of the things that first caught my attention about this is when Tucker Carlson had a guy on the show, not Nick Fuentes, even though he did have Nick Fuentes, and we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But I forget the gentleman's name. He was a historian, and he said, and Tucker Carlson got a lot of flack for this, and rightfully so. The historian said that one of the greatest villains of World War II was Winston Churchill.
What?
Yes, and I remember hearing that, and I had to go and watch the clip because I couldn't believe it. And it's like when Tucker Carlson starts inviting people on that I just think are totally misunderstanding and re-envisioning history.
Yeah.
To say that now, was Winston Churchill perfect? Absolutely not. Did some of the post-war consensus advocate for globalism and the UN and some things that I disagree? Sure, yeah. But to say that he's the greatest villain of World War II is just stupid.
That's crazy.
And but you have a lot of young men latching onto that.
He's one of its greatest heroes.
He's one of its greatest heroes, yeah. And what it was to kind of in the conversation was to downplay some of the I would say some of the true evil of the Third Reich. And so that's what I'm saying is you have these far right conservatives that are saying
Tucker's a big voice.
He is a big voice. And he's saying having people on his show that are saying dumb things like that. So you have militant Islam, you have progressives for Palestine, and you have far right conservatives that are saying stupid things like that. And then you have all these. And what's the common thread? They don't like Jewish people.
The scapegoat.
And then who's going to rise up and unite them? Right? And so that's the scary thing. Who's going to be the person that catches that and is like, okay, I can unite all these groups.
Yeah.
And the common thread is hate Jewish people.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, it's maybe not right around the corner, but if Christians are not careful and don't wake up and pay attention to this could be in the next 15, 20 years.
Could be.
So
hopefully. That's why we're talking about this.
That's why we're talking about it.
Yeah, well, I do. People may even ask, like, I mean, let's say, like, especially Gen Zers, like, why do we support Israel? You know, I do think it's important to, like, you know, remember history.
Yeah.
So we don't want to forget it because then we'll repeat it, sadly, right? I mean, you talked about I mentioned the Balfour Declaration with Great Britain, and then I think after World War II, it was the United Nations declared Israel to have a right to its own partitioned Palestine, to have a right to its own people, its own land in the Promised Land in Jerusalem. And I forgot which prime minister is the first prime minister. I think it was Ben Gurion. I forgot his first name, but basically in 1948 they declared their independence as an independent nation, the people of Israel. Because remember, they were scattered. Like, I mean, what was left after the Holocaust? They were a scattered people. They had no military. They had no organization. They had nothing like we would think of as a nation. And yet here they have, by honestly what I would say is a miracle, they get this homeland in Jerusalem. And at the same time when they did that, like, you know, however many million Arabs declared war on them. Like, they're like, no way, we're not going to, you know, this is after the Ottoman Empire, of course, but there's still, like, this is Arab land. We're not going to give this up. And so it looks pretty grim for this fledgling nation until Harry S. Truman. 11 minutes after they declared their independence, Harry S. Truman announced his full and unwavering support for the nation of Israel. That was huge.
Yeah.
And we have been, as a nation, the greatest supporter of the nation of Israel ever since. So people may be like, why are we this? That's how it happened. Now there's a lot of influences, but you can get into it in your own study. Truman was influenced by many Zionists, but he was also very influenced by his own study of the Bible. And he rightly felt they had this right and this privilege to their homeland. And it really was a miracle of God. I've heard people even say that, like, hey, what is your evidence for God? The fact that Israel even reemerged as a unified people group in a unified nation is truly a miracle after, like, 2,000 years of exile, frankly.
Sure. And for those of the people that are listening that are thinking through, like, all right, as a Christian, how am I supposed to think about some of these things politically? You again, just to reiterate, you don't have to be a Zionist.
Yeah.
So let me say it this way: to opt out of Zionism doesn't mean you hate Jewish people or anti-Semitic. So you cannot be a Zionist and still love the Jewish people and believe that God is still, like Romans 11 says, holding out a promise for them. For there to be a mass coming to faith in Jesus. Yeah. And like you also said, like, you don't have to agree with everything that the current government of Israel does, because at the end of the day, they are a secular nation state.
Yes.
They're not in covenant with God, right? Like the traditional biblical nation was. So in a lot of ways they are different. But you can as an American conservative, it's okay to support them politically for different things. Again, you can do that while also not having to agree with everything Benjamin Netanyahu says or that Mossad does.
Well, and this is where I think because you mentioned some of the sort of the, younger conservative far right groups kind of, you wonder why the Jews, like why pick on the, well, I think, man, there's a lot here, but there is kind of a resentment towards like this idea of God's chosen people. We're, as human beings in our sin, we're jealous people. And so if you look at another group who claims, well, we're God's chosen people, there's a little bit of resentment that's there. But, you and I were talking about this, like if you look at American society today, the Jewish people group are a relatively small portion of our population, yet they are very, very influential in culture, in politics, in business, like disproportionately large.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's a lot of kind of, conservative, like far-right conservative people that are kind of looking at that and kind of conjuring up all kinds of like, power, conspiracy theories, and pointing the finger at this, group of Jews running the country, if you will.
Yeah.
And so that's all of that with the backdrop of centuries of hostility towards Jewish people. As I said early on, is kind of creating a powder keg of what's going on in our country and around the world. And
I just think as Christians, we need to continue to be vigilant, aware, and reading our Bibles with both eyes open, knowing that any kind of hatred or prejudice towards any group is not of God.
Yeah.
And to also remember that the desire is for all people groups, all nations, especially Israelites, especially the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, to come to faith in Jesus. Because apart from Christ, apart from union with Christ, no one can be saved.
Absolutely.
And so that should be the posture of the church. Should be the posture of all Christians. Is how can like you said, even though just like Muslim people can be harder to reach, right, because of those family ties and cultural ties, but it doesn't mean that we don't keep at it and that we don't have a heart for the Jewish people. And like Paul said, I wished I could be cut off in a curse for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen, the Hebrews, knowing God, knowing Christ.
Yeah, that's really well said. We should have a posture of empathy and compassion and want to reach Jewish people for Christ. They need Christ, and so hey, God has put people, Jewish people around us in our communities and business or in our schools or whatever. And like I said, I mentioned our former pastor. He would tell all kinds of funny jokes about himself, of course. And he'd be like, well, the Jewish people know more about the Bible. How in the world am I supposed to witness to a Jewish person? And he said, listen, the guy that led me to the Lord was as Gentile as a ham and cheese sandwich, and he said, and my dad who refused to, this is lawn talking, my dad who refused to listen to me, anytime I would tell him about Jesus, he would just turn on the TV and ignore me. And anytime I say, Dad, I just want to read to you from Isaiah 53 about Jesus. And his dad says, son, I don't want to hear about the New Testament. It's like, no, that's not the New, that's the Old Testament, Dad.
Yeah.
And so don't be intimidated as, if you're a Gentile, which Stephen, I think I guess you have a new lineage now that we know that we dug up. No, but anyways.
So one of our pastors, Alan Taylor, he always, every time he sees me, because I told him that, he goes, "Hey, Rabbi."
Oh, gosh.
He calls me every time, and I'm like, "Oh God, thanks, Alan."
But hey, you know what? God has put people in your place. Don't be intimidated. A lot of Jews that we will encounter around us are secular Jews. They don't know the Bible. In fact, we'll probably know more about the Bible. And if they do, have a conversation, ask questions. Share the love of Jesus Christ with them. They need Jesus. God has a plan for them. They play a special part, as we mentioned, in the end times. God's not done, and He wants us to reach them in whatever way we can. Thanks again for listening to Holy Tangents. If you'd like to support us, you can visit us on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ProReggaeMedia. Currently, we are working on developing a club membership where we will be releasing exciting bonus content. In the meantime, you can donate any amount to help fund this project so we can keep having conversations on topics like the ones today. By the way, if there is a topic you would like us to discuss, please email us at proreggaemediagroup@gmail.com. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and have a great weekend.